It started like any peaceful Saturday, coffee, ducks on the lake, no worries, until a woman in a hot pink blazer and clear plastic heels marched up my gravel path, waving a Google Maps printout like a court summons. "You're in violation," she said, sharper than her eyeliner. According to her, my decades-old family cabin had magically become part of her HOA, thanks to a boundary line she'd drawn herself. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. And if you've ever dealt with a petty HOA tyrant, buckle up. This story has fake permits, illegal land grabs, and the sweetest revenge you can draw with a red pen. While she was redrawing lines on paper, I was digging through something much stronger, my grandfather's original land deed. Turns out, he'd seen people like her coming, and let's just say, that document didn't include her house. My story starts with a cabin that's been in my family since 1967. My grandfather bought this little slice of heaven on Lake Serenity when the whole area was nothing but pine trees and fishing spots. The cabin sits perfectly on a small rise overlooking the water, with hand-hewn logs that have weathered every storm for over 50 years. It's the kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think, where the biggest decision of the day is whether to fish from the dock or the shoreline. I inherited it 3 years ago when Grandpa passed, and it became my weekend sanctuary from the chaos of city life as a land surveyor. Every Friday evening I'd drive the 2 hours from downtown, and every Sunday night I'd leave refreshed and ready for another week of measuring property lines and settling boundary disputes. That peaceful routine came to a screeching halt on a sunny Saturday morning in early September. I was sitting on the front porch, coffee in hand, watching a family of ducks paddle across the lake, when I heard the unmistakable click-clack of high heels on gravel. Now, let me paint you a picture of what emerged from a bright yellow SUV. Meredith Stone looked like she'd been dressed by a blind person shopping at a 1980s costume party. She wore a neon pink blazer with shoulder pads so pronounced they could have been registered as weapons, paired with a floral skirt that had more ruffles than a wedding cake. But the crown jewel of this fashion disaster was her clear plastic high heels that sparkled with every step, making her sound like a one-woman marching band. She clutched a hot pink clipboard against her chest like a shield and marched up to my porch with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her life. "Excuse me," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she was used to people jumping when she spoke. "I'm Meredith Stone, president of the Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association, and I need to discuss some serious violations with you." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Violations?" I looked around at my peaceful cabin, the well-maintained dock, the tidy gravel driveway. "I'm sorry, violations of what exactly?" I asked, setting down my mug and standing up to face this walking rainbow of synthetic fabrics. Meredith flipped through several pages on her clipboard with theatrical precision, her acrylic nails clicking against the paper. "Your structure violates our setback requirements, the exterior finish doesn't meet our aesthetic standards, and that dock," she pointed toward the water with a nail-painted electric blue, "is completely non-compliant with our waterfront regulations." I felt my eyebrows climbing toward my hairline. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this cabin was built decades before any HOA existed out here, and I'm pretty sure I'm not part of whatever association you're talking about." Her smile was the kind you'd see on a shark circling wounded prey. "Oh, but you are. The Pinewood Heights HOA encompasses all residential properties within a 2-mile radius of the main development. That includes your little cabin." The way she said cabin made it sound like I was living in a cardboard box. I could feel my weekend zen evaporating like morning mist. "I'm going to need to see some documentation of that," I said, crossing my arms, "because last I checked, you can't just declare someone's property part of your HOA without proper legal procedures." Meredith's smile widened, showing teeth as bright and artificial as her outfit. "You'll receive official notification within 48 hours. I suggest you start thinking about compliance measures. The fines for continued violations can be quite substantial." She turned on those ridiculous plastics heels and click-clacked back to her SUV, leaving behind a cloud of perfume that smelled like a flower shop had exploded. As I watched her drive away, my confusion was rapidly transforming into something else. See, there's one thing about being a land surveyor. You develop a healthy skepticism about people who make grand claims about property boundaries without backing them up with actual documentation. And something about Meredith Stone's whole performance felt as fake as her eyelashes. I grabbed my phone and called my buddy Tom Bradley, a real estate lawyer who'd helped me with the cabin inheritance. "Tom, I need you to pull up everything you can find about something called the Pinewood Heights HOA. And I mean everything. Incorporation documents, boundary maps, the works. Tom chuckled on the other end. Let me guess, Wesley, you've met the infamous Meredith Stone. That 48-hour comment was still echoing in my head as I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the lake. But what Meredith didn't know was that 48 hours was exactly the amount of time I needed to dive deep into the history of this piece of land. And something told me that when I started digging, I was going to find some very interesting things buried in those county records. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was about to discover that sometimes the best defense against a plastic ruler is a surveyor's level and a very old map. True to her word, exactly 48 hours later, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my cabin door. The letterhead was impressive. Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association in elegant script, complete with a logo featuring pine trees arranged in a circle. But as I read through the document, my surveyor's eye caught details that made my professional instincts start screaming. The legal descriptions were vague, the reference points were inconsistent, and most tellingly, the property identification numbers didn't match the format used by our county assessor's office. This wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was actively misleading. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and started making notes. The official notice claimed my cabin violated Section 4.3 of the HOA covenants regarding structural aesthetics and historical compatibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were claiming my genuine historical cabin wasn't historically compatible. But the real red flag was in the fine print. The document referenced a property survey dated just 6 months ago, supposedly showing the expanded boundaries of the HOA jurisdiction. That survey would have cost thousands of dollars and required county approval. Either Meredith Stone had deep pockets and serious legal backing, or she was playing a very dangerous game with falsified documents. My first stop was the county courthouse, where I'd spent countless hours over the years researching property boundaries for clients. The clerk, Janet, knew me well enough to raise an eyebrow when I walked in with a folder full of documents. "What kind of trouble are you in now, Wesley?" she asked with a grin. "The kind that involves someone trying to redraw property lines without proper authorization," I replied, spreading Meredith's paperwork across the counter. "I need to see the original incorporation documents for the Pinewood Heights HOA, plus any boundary modifications filed in the last 2 years. Janet's expression grew serious as she examined the papers. "Some of these reference numbers don't look right. Give me a few minutes." What Janet found made my blood run cold. The Pinewood Heights HOA had been properly incorporated 3 years ago, but only for a small development of 12 homes on the north side of the lake. The boundary modifications Meredith referenced in her letter simply didn't exist in the county records. Either she'd filed them under a different name or she'd fabricated them entirely. But there was something even more disturbing. 3 other property owners in the area had filed complaints in the past year about HOA violations, and all 3 had eventually paid compliance fees to make the problems go away. Meredith Stone wasn't just targeting me, she was running a systematic scam. I decided my next stop should be Martha Collins, my neighbor who'd lived on the lake since the 1970s. Martha was 87 years old, sharp as a tack, and had a memory for local gossip that rivaled any historical archive. I found her in her garden, tending to roses that had been blooming longer than most of the houses in the area. "Wesley, dear, you look troubled," she said, setting down her pruning shears. "Let me guess. You've met our self-appointed neighborhood dictator." Martha's description of her encounter with Meredith was both enlightening and infuriating. "Word around here," Martha said, lowering her voice, "is that Meredith used to live over at Cedar Glen, west side of the lake. She tried to join the HOA board years ago, but got denied. Something about a zoning complaint that cost her the house. Folks say she never got over it. Came here with a plan, find a neighborhood with no active HOA and build her own little empire. Started small, but anyone who pushed back got buried in paperwork or threatened with fines. She showed up last spring with that ridiculous clipboard, telling me my garden violated some landscaping ordinance, said I needed to pay a $200 compliance fee or face legal action. I told her where she could put her compliance fee, and she hasn't bothered me since. But the Hendersons down the road paid her, and so did the young couple in the blue house." As Martha spoke, I felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Meredith was targeting people who either didn't know their rights or were too intimidated to fight back. She'd probably done enough research to make her threat sound legitimate, but she was counting on people not digging deeper into the actual legal requirements. "Martha, did she ever mention how she became president of this HOA?" I asked. The older woman's laugh was sharp with disdain. "President? Dear, from what I can tell, she appointed herself. There was never any election, never any proper board formation. She just decided she was in charge and started acting like it. That afternoon, as I was reviewing my notes and planning my next move, I heard the now familiar sound of high heels on gravel. This time, Meredith wasn't alone. She'd brought backup, in the form of a thin, nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who kept adjusting his glasses and shuffling through a briefcase full of papers. "Mr. Clark," Meredith announced, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'd like you to meet my legal representative, Mr. Johnson. He's here to discuss your options for compliance." The man stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with his role in whatever drama Meredith was orchestrating. "Sir, I'm required to inform you that continued violation of HOA covenants could result in significant financial penalties and potential legal action." I studied Mr. Johnson for a moment, noting the discount store suit, the nervous fidgeting, and most tellingly the way he kept glancing at Meredith for approval before speaking. "Mr. Johnson, are you a licensed attorney in this state?" I asked directly. His face flushed red, and he stammered something about being a legal consultant. That was all I needed to hear. "I see. And what law firm do you work for?" The stammering intensified, and Meredith quickly stepped in. "Mr. Johnson works independently, providing specialized HOA compliance services." Translation: she'd hired someone to cosplay as a lawyer and hoped I'd be intimidated enough not to ask questions. I looked directly at Meredith, noting how her neon pink blazer seemed even more garish in the afternoon sun. "Ms. Stone, I've done some research into your HOA claims, and I have some questions about the legal basis for your authority in this area. Specifically, I'd like to see the county-approved boundary expansion that you reference in your notice." For the first time since I'd met her, Meredith's confident facade cracked slightly. As they retreated to their vehicles, I realized I'd crossed from defensive to offensive. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with, and I was about to show her what happens when you try to out-survey a surveyor. The next morning, I drove to my office in town and pulled out the big guns, literally. Every surveyor has their favorite tools, and mine was a 1960s-era Transit that had belonged to my grandfather. It was the same instrument he'd used to survey half the county back in the day, including the original boundaries of what was now the Lake community. But more importantly, I had access to the original survey maps from when the area was first plotted, long before anyone dreamed of HOAs or neighborhood associations. These maps were like DNA evidence. They told the truth about property lines, regardless of what anyone wanted to believe years later. I spread the original 1967 survey across my drafting table. The paper yellowed with age, but the ink line still sharp and clear. According to these documents, my grandfather's cabin sat on a 5-acre parcel that extended from the lake shore up to the tree line with clearly marked boundaries that hadn't changed in over 50 years. But as I traced the property lines with my finger, something caught my attention. The current location of Meredith Stone's house, according to the GPS coordinates I'd looked up, fell outside the boundaries of the original Pinewood Heights development. In fact, if these maps were accurate, her house was built on what should have been conservation easement land. This discovery sent me down a rabbit hole of county records that took most of the afternoon to navigate. What I found was a masterclass in bureaucratic confusion and possibly deliberate deception. The original Pinewood Heights development had been approved for 12 homes on the north side of the lake, with strict environmental protections for the surrounding area. But over the past 3 years, there had been a series of boundary clarifications and administrative corrections that gradually expanded the developable area. Most of these changes had been signed off on by a county employee named Rick Santos, who worked in the planning department. I decided to pay Mr. Santos a visit. The county planning office was one of those beige government buildings that seemed designed to crush the human spirit, filled with fluorescent lighting and the smell of old coffee. Rick Santos turned out to be a thin, sweaty man in his 40s, who seemed genuinely surprised when I introduced myself as a land surveyor. "You're here about the Pinewood Heights modifications?" he asked, already reaching for a file cabinet. Those were all properly documented and approved. But as he pulled out the paperwork, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly, and he avoided making eye contact. Professional experience had taught me to recognize the signs of someone who knew they'd cut corners. The documents Rick showed me were professionally prepared, but they contained the same inconsistencies I'd noticed in Meredith's letter. Property identification numbers that didn't match county standards, survey reference points that didn't correspond to actual landmarks, and most suspiciously, signatures that looked remarkably similar, despite supposedly coming from different property owners. "Mr. Santos," I said carefully, "some of these property descriptions don't match the original survey markers. Have you physically verified these boundary changes?" His face went from pale to green. That's not typically required for administrative corrections," he stammered. Ms. Stone provided all the necessary documentation. Bingo. Rick Santos had been rubber stamping Meredith's paperwork without doing proper due diligence, either out of laziness or because he was getting something in return. I made copies of everything he'd shown me, noting his increasing nervousness as I photographed each document with my phone. "I may need to have our office survey these properties to verify the accuracy of these boundary changes," I told him, "just as a professional courtesy, you understand?" Rick nodded frantically, sweat now visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Of course. Whatever you need for your verification process." That evening, I was back in my cabin, surrounded by maps, surveys, and legal documents when I noticed something I'd overlooked before. Tucked into one of my grandfather's old surveying journals was a letter, addressed to me in his familiar handwriting. I'd found it months ago when I inherited his papers, but had never opened it, assuming it was just another piece of estate documentation. The envelope was marked, "For Wesley, when someone challenges the red line." Inside, I found a hand-drawn map of the lake area with property boundaries marked in red ink, along with a note that made my throat tighten with emotion. "Someday, someone will try to tell you that this land doesn't belong to our family. When that happens, trust the red lines, not the loud voices. The truth is in the measurements, not in the threats. Love, Grandpa." The red lines on Grandpa's map told a story that contradicted everything Meredith Stone had claimed. Not only was my cabin properly positioned within its original boundaries, but her entire development appeared to be built on land that should have remained undeveloped, conservation area. According to my grandfather's notes, there were underground springs and wetland areas that made the land unsuitable for large-scale construction. If he was right, Meredith's whole neighborhood might be sitting on an environmental disaster waiting to happen. More importantly, it meant that her claims to HOA authority were built on a foundation of illegally developed land. I spent the next 2 days cross-referencing Grandpa's map with current satellite imagery and county environmental records. What I discovered was even more damning than I'd expected. The area where Meredith's house stood was clearly marked in environmental surveys as sensitive wetland habitat, requiring special permits for any construction. Those permits had never been issued. Either the county had made a massive oversight or someone had deliberately buried the environmental concerns to allow development. Given Rick Santos's nervous reaction to my questions, I was betting on the latter. By the end of the week, I had assembled a file that would make any prosecutors salivate. Evidence of forged documents, environmental violations, and systematic fraud targeting multiple property owners. But I wanted to give Meredith one more chance to back down before I brought the full weight of the law down on her plastic-heeled head. I called her number, smiling as I looked at Grandpa's map spread across my table. If Meredith Stone wanted to play games with property boundaries and legal documents, she'd picked the wrong profession to mess with. Meredith agreed to meet the next evening, but not at my cabin. Instead, she insisted on hosting what she called an emergency board meeting at the community center near the lake. This should have been my first warning that she was planning something theatrical. I arrived to find the parking lot filled with cars and the building lit up like a campaign rally. Through the windows, I could see at least 30 people milling around inside, far more than the 12 homeowners who supposedly made up the legitimate Pinewood Heights HOA. The sight that greeted me inside was like something out of a suburban nightmare. Meredith had transformed herself for the occasion, trading her usual neon pink blazer for a shimmering gold lame jacket that caught the fluorescent lights like a disco ball. She stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, draped with a banner reading, "Pinewood Heights HOA, protecting property values since 2021. The irony of claiming to protect property values while wearing an outfit that looked like it came from a garage sale wasn't lost on me. Surrounding her were 5 other women, each clutching their own clipboards and wearing expressions of righteous indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Meredith announced as I walked in, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd watched too many courtroom dramas, We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community standards. Mr. Clark here has been repeatedly warned about violations on his property, yet he continues to ignore our legitimate authority. The crowd murmured with disapproval, and I realized that most of these people had no idea what the actual facts were. They'd been told just enough to make them angry, but not enough to ask the right questions. I raised my hand, feeling like I was back in elementary school. Ms. Stone, before you continue, I'd like to see the documentation that establishes your authority over my property. Specifically, the county-approved boundary expansion that includes my grandfather's cabin in your HOA jurisdiction. The room fell silent, and I could see Meredith's jaw tighten beneath her foundation. Mr. Clark, this is not the appropriate forum for technical discussions. We're here to address community concerns about compliance with established regulations. She gestured to her clipboard-wielding companions. Our board has reviewed your case thoroughly, and we're prepared to offer you one final opportunity for voluntary compliance before we pursue legal remedies. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the attack. I pulled out my folder of documents and walked to the front of the room. Since Ms. Stone mentioned the board, I'd like to know when you were elected to these positions. According to county records, the Pinewood Heights HOA has 12-member properties, but I see 5 people claiming to be board members. That's nearly half the association. When was the election? Who voted? And most importantly, where are the minutes from the board meetings where you decided to expand your jurisdiction? The questions hung in the air like smoke, and I could see several people in the audience starting to look uncomfortable. Meredith's voice took on a sharp edge that cut through her fake sweetness like a knife. Mr. Clark, your attempts to disrupt this meeting with technical objections won't change the facts. You are in violation of clearly established covenants, and continued resistance will result in significant financial penalties. She turned to address the crowd, her gold jacket shimmering as she gestured dramatically. This is exactly the kind of disrespectful behavior that threatens our property values. If we allow one person to ignore our standards, where does it end? Several people nodded in agreement, but I noticed others were whispering among themselves, clearly having doubts about the whole performance. That's when something unexpected happened. A man in the back of the room stood up, and I recognized him immediately as Chad Stone, Meredith's husband. I'd seen him around the lake occasionally, usually looking like he wished he could disappear into the background while his wife held court with other neighbors. He was a quiet guy who worked in IT and seemed to spend most of his free time trying to avoid whatever drama Meredith was creating. But tonight, something was different. His face was flushed and his hands were shaking as he clutched a folder of his own. "Meredith," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the entire room. "I can't do this anymore. This whole thing, it's wrong, and you know it." The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Meredith's face went through several different expressions: surprise, anger, and then a kind of panic that no amount of makeup could hide. "Chad, we discussed this. These are community standards that everyone needs to follow." But Chad was shaking his head, his voice getting stronger with each word. "No, Meredith, these aren't community standards. This is you trying to control people who never agreed to be controlled, and I won't be part of it anymore." The confrontation between husband and wife was painful to watch, but it cracked open the facade that Meredith had been maintaining. People started talking among themselves, asking questions about elections and board meetings that had apparently never happened. Several of the supposed board members looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. One of them, a woman in her 60s wearing a sweater covered in applique cats, actually got up and walked out without saying a word. The carefully orchestrated meeting was falling apart faster than Meredith's marriage. But Meredith Stone hadn't gotten where she was by giving up easily. As the crowd grew more restless and her authority crumbled around her, she played her final card. "Fine," she shouted, her voice now stripped of all pretense at sweetness. "If you want to be difficult, Mr. Clark, then we'll be difficult too. I'll make sure you can never sell that cabin. I'll tie it up in so much legal paperwork that you'll be paying lawyers until you're bankrupt. And as for you, Chad," she turned on her husband with fury that made several people step back, "you can find somewhere else to sleep tonight." As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Chad approached me with a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Mr. Clark, I'm sorry about all this, and I think I can help you prove what she's been doing." The next morning brought a discovery that changed everything. I was checking my mailbox when I noticed it was hanging at an odd angle, the post clearly damaged. Fresh scratches in the metal and tire tracks in the gravel told the story. Someone had accidentally backed into it during the night, but the timing was too convenient to be accidental, especially when I found a business card tucked into the damaged mailbox from Lakeside Property Management, specializing in HOA compliance and property maintenance. The phone number matched the one Meredith had given me for official HOA business. I was still examining the damage when a county sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway. My heart sank as I realized Meredith had escalated to involving law enforcement. The deputy who got out was young, probably fresh out of the academy, and he looked genuinely apologetic about whatever brought him to my door. "Sir, I'm Deputy Martinez. We received a report of vandalism in this area, and I need to ask you a few questions." He pulled out a small notebook, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Did you have any contact with a vehicle belonging to Meredith Stone last night?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Meredith damaged my mailbox, but she'd reported me for vandalizing her car. It was a level of manipulation that took my breath away. "Deputy, I was home all evening after the community meeting. I haven't left my property since yesterday afternoon, and I certainly haven't touched anyone's vehicle." I gestured toward the damaged mailbox. "But it looks like someone touched mine." Deputy Martinez examined the mailbox, taking photos and making notes. After reviewing my security camera footage that clearly showed my truck hadn't moved and no one had left my property, he closed his notebook with visible relief. But the stress of almost being arrested for something I didn't do had pushed me to a breaking point. That evening, I sat alone in my cabin with all the lights off except for a single lamp over the kitchen table, listening to the wind whistle through the pine trees outside. The documents and maps that had become my obsession were spread across every surface, but for the first time since this whole mess started, I wondered if I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. Meredith Stone was willing to lie to law enforcement and destroy her own marriage to get her way. What was to stop her from escalating even further? I picked up the letter my grandfather had left me, reading his words again by lamplight. "Trust the red lines, not the loud voices." The truth was in the measurements, he'd said, not in the threats. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by evidence of fraud and corruption, I felt more alone than I had since Grandpa died. That's when I heard a soft knock on my cabin door. I opened it to find Martha Collins standing on my porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression of motherly concern. "Wesley, dear, you look like you haven't eaten in days, and after what happened at that meeting, I thought you might need some company." Martha bustled into my cabin, setting the casserole on the stove and taking in the chaos of paperwork covering every surface. "Good heavens, you've been busy," she said, examining some of the survey maps. "You know, I was thinking about what that Stone woman said at the meeting, about community standards and property values. It reminded me of something that happened about 15 years ago. She settled into my grandfather's old recliner, smoothing her skirt as she got comfortable. There was a man named Peterson who tried to get the county to rezone this whole area for commercial development. He claimed it would increase everyone's property values, but what he really wanted was to build a strip mall." Martha's story began to weave together threads I hadn't connected before. Peterson used the same tactics: official-looking letters, threats about property values, claims about county approval that didn't exist. He even convinced a few neighbors to sign petitions supporting his development plan. "But your grandfather was the one who stopped him." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with memory. "Your grandfather pulled out his old survey equipment and proved that Peterson's development would have violated environmental protections for the lake. Peterson disappeared after that, moved away without ever admitting what he'd been trying to do." As Martha spoke, I realized that Meredith Stone was following the same playbook but with a modern twist. Instead of commercial development, she was using HOA authority as her weapon of choice. And just like Peterson, she was counting on people not having the knowledge or resources to fight back effectively. "Martha," I said, feeling energy returning to my voice, "what happened to Peterson's paperwork? Did Grandpa keep any records of how he proved the development would be illegal?" Her smile widened. "Dear boy, your grandfather kept records of everything. I'd be surprised if those documents weren't somewhere in his files." That night, I went through every box of my grandfather's surveying records, looking for anything related to the Peterson development case. What I found was better than I had hoped for: a complete file documenting environmental violations, forged permits, and county employee misconduct related to the attempted rezoning. But more importantly, I found a letter from the state environmental agency thanking my grandfather for his diligent work in protecting sensitive wetland areas from illegal development. The letter specifically mentioned the underground springs and wildlife habitat in our area, the same environmental concerns that should have prevented Meredith's neighborhood from being built in the first place. As dawn broke over the lake, I sat surrounded by 2 generations of evidence proving that this land had been under environmental protection for decades. Meredith Stone hadn't just violated HOA regulations or property boundaries, she'd built her entire development on environmentally protected land using forged county permits, and I had the documentation to prove it. I looked at my grandfather's letter one more time, understanding now why he'd been so confident about trusting the red lines. The truth wasn't just in the measurements, it was in the legal protections that those measurements represented. Meredith Stone had made the fatal mistake of picking a fight with someone whose family had been protecting this land for over 50 years. Now it was time to show her what real legal authority looked like. Armed with 2 generations of documentation and a righteous fury that had been building for weeks, I decided it was time to take this fight public. Instead of continuing to play defense against Meredith's increasingly desperate attacks, I would force her to defend her actions in front of the entire community and county officials. I called the county planning department and requested a public hearing to address irregularities in recent boundary modifications and potential environmental violations in the Pinewood Heights development area. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. in the main conference room of the county building. But I had one more card to play before the hearing. I set up my surveying equipment in the public parking area adjacent to the lake access road, right where everyone driving to the Pinewood Heights development would have to pass. The tripod, transit, and measuring chains created an impressive display that immediately drew attention from neighbors and passers-by. I brought a large-scale map of the area printed on weather-resistant material, which I spread across a folding table, weighted down with surveying tools. A small sign read, "Public Property Survey, Verifying Legal Boundaries." Professional enough to be official, but vague enough to make people curious. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within an hour, I had a steady stream of neighbors stopping to ask questions about property boundaries and environmental protections they'd never heard of. Most were genuinely curious, but the most interesting conversation came from Chad Stone, who approached me with a manila folder clutched against his chest like armor. "Mr. Clark, I know we haven't been properly introduced, but I wanted to apologize for my wife's behavior, and I think there are some things you should know about what she's been doing." Chad's hands were shaking as he opened the folder, revealing photocopies of documents I recognized as the fake HOA paperwork Meredith had been using. "She keeps copies of everything in a file cabinet in her home office," Chad explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Applications for fake permits, correspondence with Rick Santos about boundary changes, even a spreadsheet tracking how much money she's collected from neighbors for HOA fees that don't legally exist." The documents Chad showed me were devastating. Clear evidence of systematic fraud, including forged signatures on environmental impact waivers and falsified property assessments. But the most damning piece was a letter from Meredith to Rick Santos offering him a $5,000 consulting fee for expediting her boundary modification requests. As word spread about the upcoming public hearing, I began receiving calls from other property owners who'd had run-ins with Meredith's fake HOA authority. The Henderson family had paid her $300 to avoid a landscaping violation. A young couple named the Johnsons had paid her $500 for a dock compliance fee that apparently had no legal basis. Most heartbreakingly, an elderly man named Frank Miller had paid her over $1,000 for various violations after she convinced him that non-compliance would result in losing his house. The pattern was clear. Meredith was targeting the most vulnerable members of the community with threats they didn't understand. The night of the hearing, the county building's main conference room was packed. I laid out just 3 things: Grandpa's red line map, the original zoning laws, and a stack of forged permits. No long speech was needed, those papers spoke for themselves. Silence filled the room as the evidence unfolded. Meredith approached the podium, her usual confidence flickering. "These are technical objections meant to confuse," she said, her voice thin. But when officials asked about elections, permits, and finances, her answers wavered. Then Susan Bradley asked for the original incorporation documents. Meredith stalled. "They're being processed," she mumbled. A murmur swept the room. "So there was never a vote?" someone shouted. "Where's our money?" another asked. Susan's gavel struck hard. "Miss Stone, if you can't produce records, we assume bad faith." I stood and revealed the final blow. Rick Santos's signed statement admitting he approved boundary changes for cash. Gasps and angry whispers filled the room. By the end, the board voted to invalidate everything Meredith had filed and referred the case for prosecution. By the time the hearing ended at nearly 10 p.m., the county planning board had voted unanimously to invalidate all of Meredith's boundary modifications and launch a formal investigation into environmental violations in the Pinewood Heights development. More importantly, they voted to refer the evidence of fraud to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. As people filed out of the meeting room, several neighbors approached me to shake hands and thank me for standing up to what one man called the most expensive fashion disaster in county history. The most satisfying moment came when I saw Meredith leaving through a side exit, her purple sequins no longer sparkling, finally understanding that her reign of terror was over. The aftermath of the public hearing moved faster than I'd expected. Within a week, I received a call from District Attorney Investigator Sarah Chen, who wanted to meet at my cabin to discuss the evidence I'd presented. Sarah was a sharp, no-nonsense prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime, and she was fascinated by the scope of Meredith's fraud scheme. In 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've never seen someone create an entire fake homeowners association, she told me as we sat on my porch overlooking the lake. The environmental violations alone could result in significant fines and potential jail time, but the systematic fraud against multiple victims makes this a felony case. But the real bombshell came 3 days later when Sarah called with news that made my jaw drop. The state environmental agency had conducted an emergency survey of the Pinewood Heights development, using ground-penetrating radar and soil samples. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The entire development was built over a network of underground springs that fed directly into the lake's ecosystem. Not only was this a violation of environmental protections, but the construction had created unstable soil conditions that made several of the houses structurally unsafe. "Mr. Clark," Sarah said, her voice barely containing her excitement, "Meredith Stone's house is sinking, literally. The foundation has shifted 6 inches in the past year due to underground water flow." The county's response was swift and decisive. Within 2 weeks, official notices were posted throughout the Pinewood Heights development declaring it an environmental hazard zone. Residents were given 60 days to vacate their homes, while engineers determined which structures could be safely renovated and which would need to be demolished. The irony was perfect. Meredith Stone, who had spent months threatening other people's homes, was now facing the loss of her own house due to her own illegal actions. The fake HOA signs came down first, removed by county workers while news crews filmed the process for the evening broadcast. The criminal charges followed quickly. Meredith was arrested on a sunny Tuesday morning, charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and environmental violations. The local newspaper ran her mugshot on the front page, showing her in an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her artificially enhanced complexion. Rick Santos was charged as a co-conspirator and immediately suspended from his county position. The investigation revealed that Meredith had paid him over $15,000 in consulting fees to approve her fraudulent boundary modifications. Both faced potential prison sentences and massive financial restitution to their victims. But the most satisfying justice came in a form I never could have predicted. As part of the environmental remediation process, the county conducted a comprehensive survey of the original property boundaries, using modern GPS technology. What they discovered validated every measurement my grandfather had made 50 years earlier. The red lines on his hand-drawn map were accurate to within inches, proving once again that the truth really was in the measurements, not in the threats. More importantly, the survey confirmed that my cabin sat squarely within its original legal boundaries, exactly where it had been since 1967. Chad Stone's divorce from Meredith was finalized within 6 months, and he moved to a small apartment near the town center where he could start rebuilding his life away from his ex-wife's chaos. He'd become something of a local hero for standing up to Meredith at the community meeting, and several neighbors had offered him support during the difficult transition. Martha Collins organized a fundraiser to help him cover legal expenses, raising over $3,000 from community members who were grateful for his courage in exposing the truth. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything," he told me during one of our conversations. but it's still the right thing to do. The financial reckoning for Meredith was severe and comprehensive. In addition to criminal restitution, she faced civil lawsuits from every neighbor she'd defrauded, environmental cleanup costs that exceeded $200,000, and the complete loss of her house when it was condemned as structurally unsafe. The fake HOA dues she'd collected were returned to victims through a court-supervised process, but the legal fees and environmental damages consumed most of her remaining assets. By the time the legal system finished with her, Meredith Stone had lost everything: her house, her marriage, her freedom, and ironically the community standing she'd been so desperate to control. 6 months after that first encounter on my porch, I was sitting in the same spot, watching the sun set over a lake that was finally peaceful again. The Pinewood Heights development had been largely demolished, with only 3 houses deemed safe enough to renovate under strict environmental guidelines. The area was being restored to its natural state, with native plants replacing the artificial landscaping that had been imposed on the ecosystem. Property values in the area had actually increased once the environmental violations were corrected, proving that sometimes the best way to protect your investment is to follow the law. I still had my grandfather's letter framed on the cabin wall, along with his original survey map showing those prophetic red lines. Visitors often asked about them, and I'd tell them the story of how a plastic ruler met a surveyor's level, and how the truth buried in old documents proved more powerful than all the threats and fake authority in the world. The land survey equipment that had been my weapon in this battle now sat quietly in my office, ready for the next time someone tried to redraw reality to suit their purposes. As I finished my coffee and prepared to head back to town, I reflected on what I'd learned from this whole experience. Maps don't lie, but people do. And when you pick a fight with someone who draws maps for a living, you'd better make sure your own boundaries are legally sound. Meredith Stone had learned that lesson the hard way, and her story had become a cautionary tale throughout the county about the dangers of fake authority and environmental fraud. Before I locked up that evening, I took my grandfather's old red survey map, the one that saved the cabin, and framed it next to the front door. Below it, I hung a handmade wooden plaque I carved myself. Not HOA property, protected by the truth. I didn't need to say a word. Neighbors saw it, nodded, and within a week, 2 more cabins had similar signs. The red lines weren't just survey marks anymore, they were a statement. Sometimes justice comes through the courts, sometimes through community action, but in this case, it came through something as simple as trusting the red lines and refusing to be intimidated by loud voices wearing plastic shoes. The truth, as my grandfather always said, really was in the measurements.